If it's Monday, 15 days to go. Vice President Harris blitzes the must-win blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as former President Trump tours hurricane devastation in battleground North Carolina and ratchets up his rhetoric. Plus, is the richest man in the world buying votes for Trump? Election lawyers and local officials react as Elon Musk says he's giving away $1 million every day to registered voters in a key battleground state. And Israeli forces ramp up operations in Lebanon and northern Gaza as the U.S. investigates the leak of 2 top-secret documents detailing a potential Israeli counterattack against Iran. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ali Vitale in Washington, just 15 days out from Election Day, with a lot of action underway on the campaign trail right now, and with polls pointing to an incredibly tight race. Both Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are on the campaign trail, making multiple stops in key swing states. The vice president hitting every blue wall state in a single day, campaigning alongside former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, warning disaffected Republicans and Trump's skeptical moderates that the fate of the election could be in their hands. Take a listen to how she laid it out at a Philadelphia event.
I've taken the oath of office 6 times. And for the elected leaders here, we know it is an oath that one must take sincerely and unequivocally. It is not about the individual. It is not about what is in their personal interest. It is about what is for and in the spirit of the public good. And this is a moment in this election that presents a real contrast among how I, as one of the 2 nominees, and my opponent, the former president, think of that duty.
It comes as the former president is leaning into strongman rhetoric, claiming in interviews that his political rivals, including prominent Democrats, are, quote, the enemy from within, and that he would consider using the military against them. The Harris campaign has seized on those comments as the former president doubles down on them, putting some of his most prominent supporters on the defensive as they try to rewrite Trump's comments.
One of the first things you did when you joined Congress was to create the Honor and Civility Caucus. Does wanting to use the military against political opponents, would that pass muster with the Civility Caucus?
That's not... Jake, you know that's not what he's talking about there. What he's talking about is marauding gangs of dangerous, violent people who are destroying public property. What President Trump is talking about is that they have been attacking and maligning him from the day he came down that golden escalator. Everybody knows that's true. Kamala Harris has used language saying he's so dangerous to the country. I mean, I've had colleagues in the House say he must be eliminated. He must be extinguished.
He's literally talking about
this stuff is over the top.
You know, against Democrats. I mean, he's literally talking.
No, he's not. No,
yes,
no, he's not, Jake. No, he's not. No, he's talking about using the National Guard and the military to keep the peace in our streets.
Just a few hours after that interview, Mr. Trump explicitly called his political rivals, including former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the enemy from within.
That's an enemy from within. That is a threat to democracy. These are bad people. We have a lot of bad people. But when you look at Shifty Schiff and some of the others, yeah, they are, to me, the enemy from within. I think Nancy Pelosi is an enemy from within.
The former president also ramping up his incendiary rhetoric against Vice President Harris with personal attacks and profanity.
You have to tell Kamala Harris that you've had enough, that you just can't take it anymore. We can't stand you. You're a vice president. The worst. You're the worst vice president. Kamala, you're fired. Get the hell out of here. You're fired. Get out of here.
Harris responded to those remarks in an interview with MSNBC's Al Sharpton.
What you see in my opponent, a former president of the United States, really is, it demeans the office. And I have said, and I'm very clear about this, Donald Trump should never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. He has not earned the right. He has not earned the right. And that's why he's going to lose.
Former President Trump's incendiary rhetoric is just the tip of the spear of a campaign operation that is anything but conventional. On Saturday, he went off topic at a Pennsylvania rally with a crude remark about the anatomy of golf legend Arnold Palmer. Then on Sunday, he staged an appearance at a local McDonald's, pushing his claim that Harris is lying about working at the fast food restaurant when she was younger. And this afternoon in North Carolina, he again shared false accusations about the federal response to Hurricane Helene and FEMA spending. With all that, let's bring in our NBC News reporters following every angle on the campaign trail. Garrett Haake is with the Trump campaign in North Carolina. Julie Sirkin is with the Harris campaign in Michigan. Jesse Kirsch is outside a polling place in South Florida, where early voting is now underway. And Ryan Nobles is on the road in Texas as he chases both of the Senate candidates in a race Democrats are hoping turns competitive. We'll get to Texas, but first, Texas' favorite son, Garrett Haake, you are in North Carolina, and Trump's first stop, he repeated some of his false claims about the Hurricane Helene response and FEMA's own response to that. What did you hear?
Yeah, Allie, I think we heard sort of a kaleidoscopic view of Trump's false claims about the hurricane response here, suggesting that the federal government wasn't doing enough, saying he doesn't know the governor here, that the governor wasn't doing enough, and promising to take over and do a better job if and when he's elected president. I will say on that portion, he was slightly more forward-looking than I have frankly heard from him in the past, when he's been even more conspiratorial about the hurricane response. But I have to tell you, just within the last few minutes at his second event, we've switched back to Trump's favorite conspiracy, which has been about vote counting, suggesting that he wants to have God come down and count the votes, that might change the results in places like California, and that who counts the votes is more important than who casts the votes. So we're getting a sort of a wide view of the various conspiracies available to the former president today.
Well, speaking of those conspiracies, and one of Trump's tried and true favorites, of course, around the 2020 election that he lost. But our colleague Vaughn Hilliard asked him today if he's seen cheating so far in this election, and he said no. So where does that leave him when he then tries to revive the claims later on?
Yeah, Allie, and I think this is such an important moment. We should probably play the clip of Vaughn putting Donald Trump on the record today that the process has been clean. Here's what the former president said.
Mr. President, since Chairman Whatley is here, have you, 2 weeks out from the election, have either of you seen any cheating, incidents of cheating, that leads you to believe that this election will not be fair?
Well, I haven't. Unfortunately, I know the other side, and they are not good. But I have not seen. Michael, have you seen anything that looks suspicious? We're very early in the process. But.
Yeah, we're very early in the process, and we're tracking across all 50 states right now to make sure that the systems that we want to have in place are in place, and we're very happy with the initial results.
So, Allie, a lot of caveats there about being very early in the process. And I think that makes sense, given that the way Donald Trump talks about this election, including today, is that he cannot possibly lose unless the votes aren't counted fairly. Of course, that's not how this works. He'll lose if he has fewer votes cast in his name. But until the counting is done, there's no cheating to identify, at least in his view.
Well, we also mentioned this, some of the enemy from within comments that he's been making. Do those move the ball anymore? And I mean, Garrett, even just think about the conversation that you and I are having right now. We're talking about an election not being stolen because the elections in the United States are secure. We're talking about what he did, those off-color remarks that he made at that Pennsylvania rally. Do any of these comments have utility in actually persuading or turning out voters?
Allie, you know my view on this, as viewers of this show do, that there is very few, if any, people left in this country who are undecided about Donald Trump. I think most of them are undecided if they are still deciding about Kamala Harris, who's the lesser-known commodity at this stage. That said, if this is sort of the last thing kind of at the top of your mind when you're making that choice, these things could still change voters' minds around the edges. But I have a hard time imagining that if you weren't exposed to this kind of language by Donald Trump, on which he's been so consistent for the last 8 years, up until now, that you're suddenly waking up to say, I can't believe he's talking this way about Democrats and his political opponents. I just have a hard time believing that those voters out there have consciences left to be shocked by these commentary if they weren't already there.
Yeah, he's one of the best-known political brands in politics. I don't think anyone is just learning about Donald Trump. Garrett Haake, thanks for joining us. On to Julie Sirkin now. Kamala Harris has spent the day campaigning with former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney. I think that is still a fascinating split screen for those of us who covered Cheney on Capitol Hill. But what did you hear from them, and what does it tell you that the Harris campaign sees her time best spent 15 days out from Election Day campaigning with a former Republican?
It is such a fascinating dynamic, Allie. You're exactly right, because this is somebody who was a member of House Republican leadership. Afterwards, of course, she was kicked out from that role when she went on to have some very strong disagreements, very strong comments against the former president. Of course, then heading up that January 6th Select Committee investigating Trump's actions on January 6th that we all covered. And the purpose of having Cheney appear with Harris through this swing in these Rust Belt suburbs is to try and reaffirm to the very small sliver of undecided voters, perhaps Republicans who are anti-Trump, who don't want to vote for him but are unsure if Harris is maybe too progressive, too left-leaning. Cheney's role here at all of these events is to reaffirm them that she is a constitutional conservative, that her father, of course, served in the Bush administration, and even she and her father are supporting Harris for president, and of course talking about the very salient message that is resonating with these voters, that they believe that Trump is a threat to democracy.
Well, that is the central point that we've heard, of course, from Congresswoman Cheney, but also from Vice President Harris. She has continuously brought up Trump's fitness for office, both as a danger to the republic as well as his mental state. As you've been out there talking to voters, is that a message that resonates? Because to me, it sort of feels like Battle for the Soul of the Nation 2.0 with a very different messenger.
Yeah, absolutely. Allie, and Harris has kind of revived that message in the last couple of days after the former president canceled several media appearances. And Harris does think this is a popular message that will work with voters, work with her base and the people she's trying to get into her corner. And it's in part because this is a very effective line of attack that Trump used against Joe Biden, who was at the top of the ticket. The president, of course, he found talking about his mental fitness, talking about his age, worked with voters, worked with getting them to his side of the aisle. Well, now Harris can say, look, this is a 78-year-old, so put aside his age, but also look at what he's done in the last couple of years. His threats against democracy is something Harris is focusing on, talking about his mental fitness. Trump is paying attention, too. This is something that is getting under his skin. He posted on social media a couple of hours ago, talking to that effect, calling Harris low IQ individual, flipping the script on her, or trying to. So certainly this is a message that is working for Harris and something that we are continuing to hear throughout her appearances with Cheney today.
Yeah, getting under Trump's skin has always been a feature, not a bug, of the Harris campaign strategy. Julie, quickly, the Harris administration is also going all out to court black men. What are they doing to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Barack Obama, the former president, is joining her on the campaign trail later this week in Georgia on Thursday. Since he was in office, we haven't seen that kind of turnout. Black men voting for Democrats, not Joe Biden. And certainly this is a demographic that Harris is worried about. And it comes as the former president is trying to cut into those margins, right? We saw recent polling come out, how the shift, especially black men under 50, more of them are thinking about voting for Trump than pretty much ever before, at least in modern history. And so this is something that Harris and her campaign are taking very seriously. Earlier this month, Allie, we saw her team release a strategy specifically focused on economic opportunities for that group of black men specifically. And of course, we saw that yesterday as well when she celebrated her 60th birthday in Georgia, speaking at a black church. We saw the pastor there talk to the voters there, say you have to support a woman for president, and essentially telling them to do just that on November 5th when they vote for Harris.
Birthdays on the campaign trail. I think we've all been there. Julie Sirkin, thank you. Jesse Kirsch, you are in Miami-Dade County in Donald Trump's adopted home state, where early voting is now underway. What are you hearing from voters in this previously Democratic stronghold county, but 2022 spelled all signs of trouble there?
Yeah, and that, of course, is something that Governor Ron DeSantis, Allie, loves to point to as one of his bona fides in terms of when he was running for president. The governor, though, some of his backed candidates in primary races here this spring did not fare so well. So, you know, it's something to be seen when we talk about if Miami-Dade County itself is shifting. Certainly the state seems to be shifting to ruby red if it's not already firmly there from a state that used to be one of those key battlegrounds, right? We've been talking with voters here. There are a couple issues that are getting specific attention in Florida. There's a vote on recreational marijuana being approved. Here, there's also a vote on enshrining expanded abortion access in the state. This is one of 10 states with an abortion ballot measure up for a vote this fall. And of course, that is an issue that is being focused on by people all over the country. It's something we're wondering about how it could factor into the presidential race. So it has that much more attention potentially here in this state. I caught up with two voters earlier, one who is backing Vice President Harris, the other backing former President Trump. Here's part of what we heard from both of them. Is there anything about Kamala Harris that you specifically like that resonates with you, or is it more about voting against Trump than voting for Harris?
Definitely voting against Trump.
What draws you to vote for former President Trump? Why do you like his policies?
President Trump is, I believe he's a true patriot. He may be a billionaire, but he's a true patriot, and I really believe that he loves the United States of America. And we want a leader. A lot of people criticize the way he talks and stuff. I don't care. I want a leader that is going to save this country.
And that voter also told me that she made a point of coming to vote early in person because she has some concerns, didn't point to anything specific, but had vague concerns about how elections are being carried out. And that just speaks to, Allie, something we hear all over the place. It continues to be one of the undercurrents of this election is the ramifications of all of the fraud allegations back in 2020. So, it's something that continues to be out there. And I can tell you that woman is one of more than 27,000 people who have voted early in person today on the first day of early in-person voting here in Miami-Dade County. Those are the unofficial numbers. We, of course, don't have any kind of results at this point. But as we love to say, the voters are voting. Allie.
We do love when the voters are voting in one of my favorite political states of Florida, where all of the things you say are right, and they might have implications on another Senate contest that's also on our radar. Jesse Kirsch, thanks for joining us. Ryan Nobles, you're in Texas. Speaking of Senate contests, a state that has eluded Democrats down ballot for years now. They are hoping, though, that Colin Allred can make it a contest against Ted Cruz. So what's Allred's argument for why he's the one who's finally going to make it happen?
Well, the big thing he's trying to do, Allie, and it struck me when we spoke to him earlier today, is trying and separate himself from all this history that Texas Democrats have had. He doesn't want to run on the record of Texas Democrats or national Democrats for that matter. He's trying to make the case directly to Texans. It's Colin Allred who wants to represent you in Texas. He describes himself as a fourth-generation Texan, somebody that was a football star at Baylor, grew up just a few miles from the polling location that he voted at. That he's not worried about the Democratic history in this state because he's trying to chart a new course. Listen to what he told me earlier.
Well, in a way, it's not really about that to me. This is a different question, which is who's better to serve us for the next 6 years, Ted Cruz or me? We've seen for 12 years how Senator Cruz has served, how he went to Cancun when we needed him most, how he tried to overturn the American presidential election, how he's singularly responsible for this abortion ban here in Texas. I've been the most bipartisan Texan in Congress. I'm the exact opposite. And so while we have a lot of history building up to this is a singular choice for Texans that's a little bit different from what we've had in the past.
And so you see what Colin Allred is attempting to do here, right? He wants this race to be about Ted Cruz. And while Republicans and Republican politics Star State, Donald Trump should win here easily, Ted Cruz as an individual may not be that popular. So what the pitch that Colin Allred is making to these Texans is, I'm different than him. I'm different than the Texas Democrats. I'm different than the Democrats in Washington, D.C., and I'm certainly not Ted Cruz. So if you can just kind of deep connection that you have to the Republican Party and give me a chance, I'll try and be a different kind of senator for you. Allie, whether or not that's going to resonate here in Texas, I think is still something that remains to be seen because the operation here for Republicans is very strong and continues to get stronger. So Texas, they have a hope. Democrats have a hope, but almost everything has to go right in order for Colin Allred to be successful in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Ryan. Everything would have to go right, but Democrats have been working the ground there for many years, hoping that this is the moment it finally comes to fruition. Ryan Nobles, thank you for joining. Frank Thorpe, thank you for driving carefully. And we have an important programming note here. My colleague Hallie Jackson will be sitting down with Vice President Kamala Harris for an exclusive one-on-one interview. You can watch it tomorrow at 6:30 Eastern on NBC Nightly News. Coming up, who wants to be a millionaire? Legal questions abound after Elon Musk offers cash to some registered voters in battleground states while stumping for former President Trump. I'll phone a friend who's also an election expert next. Plus, there's the race for president and there's the race to count the votes. We have new reporting on the effort to speed up ballot counting in all-important Michigan. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Elon Musk is using his money and his social media platform to promote Donald Trump ahead of the election. But some experts say his latest efforts potentially violate the law. Musk announced on Saturday that his pro-Trump super PAC would award $1 million prize each day to random swing state voters who sign a petition from his pro-Trump super PAC. He presented these large checks during rallies in Pennsylvania. Some legal experts say that violates federal law prohibiting paying people to register to vote. The former president did not comment when reporters pressed him on the issue yesterday. And the Justice Department's also not commenting on the matter. But Pennsylvania Governor and former Attorney General Josh Shapiro told Christian on Meet the Press yesterday that he was troubled by the payments.
I think there are real questions with how he is spending money in this race, how the dark money is flowing, not just into Pennsylvania, but apparently now into the pockets of Pennsylvanians. That is deeply concerning. Look, Musk obviously has a right to be able to express his views, but when you start flowing this kind of money into politics, I think it raises serious questions that folks may want to take a look at.
With me now is Nate Persily, a former senior research director for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. He's now a professor at Stanford Law School and an NBC News election law analyst. Nate, your fellow election law expert Rick Hassin points out that Musk could be violating Title 52, Chapter 103, and Section 10307 of the United States Code, which, for anyone who doesn't just have that in their back pocket, says whoever pays or offers to pay or accepts payment either for registration to vote or for voting shall be fined not more than $10,000 or imprisoned not more than 5 years or both. So given that statute, is Musk violating it?
So the central question here is whether he's paying people to register to vote or if he's paying people to sign a petition. And that's the critical difference. And since he says that only registered voters will be eligible for this kind of lottery in order to get the $1 million, that is something that the DOJ has contemplated in its guidelines and actually has specified lotteries as something that you can't offer people as a reward for registering to vote. I think that, he would say that he's just trying to pay people to sign this petition, but that, then he should open it up to everybody, not just people who he'd be rewarding for registering.
Yeah, you bring up a technicality here, right? He's saying that he's awarding this money to a voter that signs a petition, not actually paying people to register. But is that a legitimate defense if this were ever to end up in a courtroom, which we are so not there yet?
That's right. I doubt we will get there. Right. But, and this just shows you how the norms of our politics are disintegrating around us. We've never dealt with a particular issue like this. There are examples of people being prosecuted or disciplined for example, giving people coupons to fast food restaurants if they turn out to vote, or even Ben & Jerry's at one point withdrew an offer to, reward people with ice cream if they were to come and show that they voted. You have to make the offer to all people, not whether they're registered or not whether they voted or not. And so, there is some legal liability here. I don't think we will see this in court, but it just shows how much he's pressing the envelope here. I should also say the media coverage of this has now led, I think, to increased popularity of his super PAC. And so he's sort of achieved, I think, what he really wanted to do, which was to motivate people to pay attention to his efforts in politics in the battleground states.
Well, I guess that's the cost benefit that you're weighing here if you're Elon Musk, right? So would the world's wealthiest person contend that the potential penalty here is worth the potential crime, which is, is the juice worth the squeeze in terms of turning out Trump voters?
I think he probably is making that calculation. I don't know whether it's going to have much of an impact. He has actually tweeted today that he thinks that there's been increased Republican registration as a result. This is something we could look at after the election. But I think that, again, it's now a tool that is being used by one political actor. It's not going to stop there. If this becomes part of our politics, we can expect all kinds of rewards being made in order for people to register and potentially to vote.
Because at this point, the Justice Department isn't commenting, but would you expect them to investigate this, especially if media coverage and this particular ask from Musk continues?
I don't think they will, in part because in an election season, the DOJ is particularly gun-shy about trying to investigate these types of actions, especially given the accusations of partisanship that are flowing with respect to all the other investigations of Trump that are going on. And so I think he's going to get off in doing this. I'll say one thing, which is that the registration date in Pennsylvania sort of ends today. And so if as an inducement to register, it's kind of time-bound. It's not going to have as big an impact going forward, but it does set a precedent for what might be a more traditional form of motivation in politics generally.
And as you look at this, are there any other potential laws that Musk might be breaking with these million-dollar payments?
Well, it depends also on Pennsylvania law because and the other laws in the battleground states, because we've been focusing on the federal law, but each one of the states also has rules about what you can do in terms of incentivizing people to vote or incentivizing registration. And so I take Josh Shapiro seriously, since he used to be the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, when he says that there are potential legal liabilities there.
Certainly that is someone that you have to pay attention to if they are looking at this and saying, maybe I got some questions about this. But Nate Persily, thank you for answering ours on this lovely Monday.
My pleasure.
And it's important to remember that if the presidential race is tight, which it probably will be, we might be looking at an election week, not election day. Each state handles vote counting differently, and some of the most closely watched states don't start processing ballot envelopes until election day itself. But in battleground Michigan, where early voting began this weekend, officials are taking steps to speed up the process. NBC's Shaq Brewster has more.
They're two battleground states, Michigan and Wisconsin, whose late into the night vote counts 4 years ago descended into chaos. But only one has made major changes to help avoid this.
What we see here is essentially an increasing mob-like scene.
Protesters harassing poll workers in Detroit, scrambling to count the surge of absentee ballots.
My life was threatened. My staff's life was threatened.
Now, a new law in Michigan gives clerks a head start, allowing them to process absentee ballots well before Election Day.
I think it would show voters that the process is clean, that the process is open.
The changes will likely limit a so-called red mirage on election night. That's what happened in 2020, when many cities reported in-person voting results first, which tended to favor Republicans. But absentee ballots, which were more Democratic-leaning, took longer to count.
100% reporting didn't take place until Wednesday morning.
Trump's lead in Michigan vanished later that morning when Detroit's Wayne County reported nearly 150,000 votes. Predictable changes that were used to fuel false claims of illegal ballot dumps.
And then, boom, all of a sudden, I go from winning by a lot to losing.
With this new law, when will Detroit have its results posted?
We'll have our results posted by 11 o'clock news. 90 to 95% of our results will be posted by then.
In the week before Election Day, you'll actually see these envelopes opened and the ballots put into vote tabulators here in Michigan. While here in Wisconsin, you may see results come in later. That's because absentee ballots stored here cannot even be opened until Election Day.
Regardless of the efficiencies we make, just the sheer number makes us be one of the last people, if not always the last jurisdiction to report results.
In 2020, Milwaukee finished counting at 3:42 a.m., pushing Biden ahead in Wisconsin. Do you have any projection for when Milwaukee will have its vote reported this year?
I don't. I think what we should expect, though, is not before midnight.
43 states allow clerks to process ballot envelopes before Election Day. But despite bipartisan efforts to change election laws, that doesn't include critical battlegrounds Pennsylvania and Wisconsin.
If the American public wants to see our results sooner, there has to be legislative change.
A change to speed up the count in the most competitive states. Shaquille Brewster, NBC News, Detroit.
Thanks to Shaq for that really essential reporting. And coming up next, former President Trump on the campaign trail, serving up McDonald's French fries and serving up some bizarre comments about the late golfer Arnold Palmer. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we mentioned, with just over 2 weeks to Election Day, former President Trump has devoted time on the trail to some, shall we say, unconventional campaign issues. Yesterday, using a photo op to accuse Vice President Harris, without evidence, of lying about working at McDonald's, as he hit the fryer at a McDonald's that was not open to the public, with customers pre-selected by the franchise owner and the campaign. That appearance came after Mr. Trump kicked off his Saturday rally in Pennsylvania with an extended riff about golf legend Arnold Palmer that included crude comments about Palmer's anatomy.
Arnold Palmer was all man, and I say that in all due respect to women, and I love women. But this is a guy that was all man. His man was strong and tough. And I refuse to say it, but when he took showers with the other pros, they came out of there, they said, oh my God, that's unbelievable. I had to say it.
Joining me now, our panel, Francesca Chambers, White House correspondent for USA Today, Amisha Cross, Democratic strategist and former communications advisor to President Obama, and Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and former senior communications advisor to the Tim Scott campaign. Francesca, to you first, because I think in any other world where we showed those two clips of a major presidential candidate, it would move the needle in some way, and yet today it just sort of seems like shrug. Where are we in this race that there is no longer a thing like a Michael Dukakis moment or a Howard Dean scream that sort of shakes things loose?
And the Harris campaign has been trying to draw attention to some of Trump's comments by now playing them at her rallies. And her closing argument is essentially that he's unfit, he's unstable, he has no plans, and he'll take away your rights. Now, when we look at polling, though, as to whether those arguments, as you were pointing out, are working, I've seen polling that shows that when it comes to the question of mental soundness, that Trump is polling right behind Vice President Kamala Harris when it comes to that issue. So it isn't really sticking so far with voters, but there's a couple weeks left in this campaign.
I guess, Matt, I would ask you as a Republican communications strategist to make the case for why a Republican contender might say those things on the trail. What good does that do?
I don't know about talking about Arnold Palmer's drunk is going to win voters over, but I'll say that entertaining. But the McDonald's thing was a great little campaign event. Just like you have people, you do little campaign stunts. It puts a message across. He does this exact same thing here. Like when Harris went to Primanti Brothers in Pittsburgh last month, it's the same sort of thing. It conveys a message, and it has a little bit of a relatability factor to it. And one other thing I think that reminds me a little bit of 2016. This weekend, he really blotted out the sun on this, and people are responding to him in a large way. Where I can't really tell you what news Kamala made over the weekend, really. And so it allows her, it starves her of oxygen, allows him to kind of get in the front seat a little bit, which is a change where things work for a lot of this campaign.
But I guess what I have heard from Vice President Harris, and I agree that there has been a dominating factor to the way that Trump has been out there, but what I do hear from the Vice President is a real centralizing of Trump's mental fitness and acuity. Is that what he would want? I mean, going down this stretch, and is her message breaking through, I think is the more important thing.
Well, I think people already know who Donald Trump is. That doesn't mean that you don't press him on the things that he said on the campaign trail, up to and including threatening people who do not believe the same as he does, or people who are not going to vote for him, with threatening them with prosecution so he can get elected and all these other things, spreading his authoritarianism far and wide. But I think that it's also playing the game that he's playing. Donald Trump is known to lie fast and often. He's also known to try to tap into American emotion in a way that is supposed to speak to the people who feel like they're the little man. And I think that that was part of the reason why the McDonald's stunt was done. Kamala Harris said that she worked there while she was putting herself through school. I know I've held several low-wage jobs when I was putting myself through college as well. At the end of the day, is that going to appear on the resume? No. You can look at my LinkedIn right now. You're not going to see all of the odds and end jobs I did in college. But I think that for him, it was a publicity stunt. And to your point, it was a closed McDonald's. This is also a guy who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. I think of that publicity stunt the same way that I think of that early 2000s show, The Simple Life, when Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie were out here choosing to do regular people jobs. At the end of the day, they could go home back to their millions. The average person who's working at McDonald's cannot. And when you have a Republican Party that is pushing against low-wage jobs, who does not want to provide affordable child care, affordable housing, that doesn't want to provide an adequate minimum wage, then the conversation is over.
I think, Matt, you're touching on a really interesting point about the campaign's different strategies right now. Is the Harris campaign's goal here to try and create a bunch of news, or is it, as the vice president said in an interview last week, is to have repetition of the same thing over and over, so that voters who say that they don't feel like they have enough details about her policies or don't know what she'd do or don't know much about her start to hear some of those things.
But you know, you're even hearing different things, though, because, again, for the first 3 months of her campaign, it was a lot about the plans. You haven't heard the housing plan. You haven't heard the $25,000 for the folks now. Her campaign has shifted in a lot of respects where it's much more of a contrast message. And I think that kind of also belies where a lot of this race is going a little bit more, having for her to really knock down Trump as an alternative, not just push herself up.
But I also think that there is a certain aspect of Trump's rhetoric that is a bit doom and gloom, especially when you hear him out there talking about the enemy within. We'll play some clips of that coming up in a little bit. But is that what the Republican Party's messaging is centered around now? Some of this more dour campaigning style? I mean, you worked for a guy. I was out there with Tim Scott. He had an optimistic message, and people were like, yeah, thanks, I'm good.
I think I think there's also an intentionality behind it, right? We were seeing Trump go to a barbershop, go to McDonald's. It puts him in a position that's very humanizing, right? So when you get the apocalyptic rhetoric on the other side, too, saying he's an democracy, it makes people think, wait a minute, that doesn't really match up, right? And so I think that is the intention also about putting in these softer scenarios where it does humanize him quite a bit and he can relate to people a little easier.
But January 6th isn't eradicated by going to a barbershop.
But I think picking up on that, you bring up January 6th because that's so central to former Congresswoman Cheney. The fact that Harris is out there with Cheney in these closing days of the campaign, to me, says a lot about the coalition that the Harris team is trying to build. What does it tell you that their strategy is, let's bring in disaffected Republicans, as opposed to let's get out there and get out our base?
I think it says a lot. They can do both things at the same time. And I think that the Harris campaign has proven that they are doing those. But she's also making sure that she is reaching those disaffected Republicans, those Republicans who are leaning towards Nikki Haley, those Republicans who are turned off by the rhetoric from Donald Trump. We weren't talking about Arnold Palmer aside from his golf swing, and now we're talking about Arnold Palmer and whatever his junk may be. At the end of the day, there are people that are greatly disturbed by what Donald Trump does regularly, and I think that those people can be persuadable. It's just that's a much smaller, I think, piece of the pie at this point in this election cycle than was probably assumed previously.
And we were just seeing on the screen for viewers at home live footage of that rally that Harris was holding with Cheney, the second of today, this one in Michigan, as they try to, again, focus their message on democracy and on Trump as a threat to that democracy. But Francesca, on the enemy within comments that we have heard several times now over the course of the closing weeks, Republicans have taken some different defense postures in trying to explain away what Trump meant when he really did mean what I think all of us took him to mean. Listen, for example, to what Senator Lindsey Graham told Kristen on Meet the Press yesterday.
We're winning and going to win, not because of what Donald Trump's saying, but because of what they've done for 4 years. You know why Donald Trump is going to win this election? 70% of the people think we're going in the wrong direction. And when Vice President Harris is asked, what would you do different? She says, nothing comes to mind. They're trying to disqualify him. Have you heard lately, let me tell you why you should vote for me, because I'm going to make your life better? No, it's all about Trump. They got no other game to play.
So is he right? Is Trump's rhetoric just all baked in and voters don't care?
Well, the Harris campaign is trying to make it an issue. You talked about how she was out there campaigning today with Liz Cheney. It's not just that she's trying to get disaffected Republicans. Note that she is in 3 suburban counties today. Now, 2 of those, President Biden won last time, but one of them was a Republican won county in the previous election. And so part of the argument is really trying to turn out in large numbers suburban women in this election. Now, is the number of women that she could potentially boost above what 2020 was enough to offset the losses that she's suffering right now with men? It doesn't look like it in the polling when you see polls like ours today, which show a tied national race. And now I know that that's not state-based polling, and we're looking at very state-based numbers, but it does, to your point, tell you a lot about the coalition of people and how they're feeling about the vice president right now.
Is there anything surprising to you, Matt, about the coalition that Trump seems to be putting together here? You look at the way numbers are changing around Latino voters, around black voters. What do you think?
I think low propensity voters are really what could be the story of this election at the end, right? And you see these large early vote numbers coming out of Nevada and other early states. It's telling me that some of these folks are going for the Trump campaign, if not a lot of them. I think that'll be the story if Trump wins on election night. African-American men, Latino men, those margins, obviously women, we have our issues, without a doubt.
Certainly Nikki Haley's been vocal about those.
And so now it's a matter of can we extend our margin among men to offset that? If we do, it's our ball game.
Amisha, I owe you the last word the next time that you are on. But Amisha, Francesca, Matt, my friends, thank you all for joining us at this critical juncture. After the break, fighting election disinformation. I'll talk to the Biden administration's top cybersecurity official about the biggest domestic and foreign threats to this year's election. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The FBI and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA for short, is once again warning voters that foreign actors are seeking to influence the U.S. election. In their latest announcement, the agencies outlined how countries like Russia, China, and Iran are spreading disinformation and amplifying false claims, including with new AI-enabled tools. We should note the FBI and CISA also say they have no information suggesting malicious cyber activity has compromised U.S. election infrastructure ahead of Election Day. Joining me now is Jen Easterly, director of CISA, which helps oversee election infrastructure and protect it against cyber threats. Jen, thanks for joining us. I think first, what do people need to know about these foreign malign influence campaigns, and how can they protect themselves from falling victim, especially in an online world that moves so fast and people's attentions are so divided?
Yeah, well, great to be with you, Allie. So the document that you referenced is really focused on election security. So CISA serves as the federal government lead for election infrastructure security. And what we were warning about in that public service announcement with our FBI colleagues was exactly that. Foreign adversaries from Russia, Iran, China, who remain intent on two key goals. First, to undermine American confidence and trust in our election systems and our democratic processes, and two, to stoke partisan discord. And as we've been warning for the last several months, along with the intelligence community, foreign adversaries are more active now than they ever have been, which is why it's so important that Americans are aware of these activities and that they take these warnings seriously. So we've been putting this information out. I do think your point about influence operations versus interference, we have seen our foreign adversaries very active in terms of malign influence and disinformation. We have not seen them actively trying to get into our election infrastructure.
That is a really important distinction, I think, especially the way that we saw conspiracy theories proliferate after the 2020 election. But I want to go back to your report, which talks about foreign actors now using AI-enabled tools. You talk about how they're more active than they've ever been, but have these influence campaigns also become more sophisticated compared to what we saw in 2016 and 2020?
Yeah, we have. I mean, what we saw in 2016 was Russian attempts to interfere and influence in the elections. That's why election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure, and that's why CISA was made the federal government lead. In 2020, we saw activities from Iran. Now we're seeing Russia, Iran, and China. And yes, they are using AI-enabled capabilities to help them create synthetic media, fake social media, personas, to help them get disinformation out, to influence the American people. So it is very active. But I do think it's really important for Americans to understand that because of all the work that's been done over the past 8 years with the election community, bringing together the federal government, the state and local election officials who run elections, and the election vendor community, the reality is that election infrastructure has never been more secure, and the election stakeholder community never better prepared to run free, fair, safe, secure elections. Now, our foreign adversaries will try to convince us that that is not true, but that's why we're putting out these warnings and information so Americans can be armed, understanding what our adversaries are attempting to do.
Yeah, you know, though, it's not just foreign disinformation that we've seen. We have seen former President Donald Trump spread false claims about election security. Even just take a listen to some recent examples, and we'll talk about them on the other side.
The mail-in voting isn't working. It's corrupt. But until then, Republicans must win. We did great in 2016. A lot of people don't know. We did much better in 2020. We won. We won. We did win. It was a rigged election. It was a rigged election. They're going to cheat. They cheat. That's all they want to do is cheat. And when you see this, it's the only way they're going to win.
So what's your response then, and how do you discredit false claims coming from the Republican presidential candidate, a former president himself?
Yeah, so just to be clear, there is no evidence that malicious actors changed, altered, deleted votes, or had any material impact on the outcome of the 2020 election. That has been validated time and again, including in multiple court cases with judges from both appointed by both parties and through multiple intelligence assessments. And in any race that was close in 2020, there were paper records which could be counted and recounted to ensure accuracy. In this role, I spent an enormous amount of my time with state and local election officials of both parties across the country. I know how tirelessly they work to ensure that every one of their citizens' votes are counted as cast. It's why I say I have such great confidence in the security of election infrastructure. Yeah. But let's look at why, Allie. Well, first of all, at the end of the day, the systems that Americans use to vote, not connected to the internet.
Yep.
Over 97% paper ballots, multiple layers of safeguards, cybersecurity, physical security in place to protect election infrastructure from compromise, to include pre-election testing of systems to ensure accuracy and post-election audits. And every state runs things a little differently. As the saying goes, if you've seen one state's election, you've seen one state's election. Different equipment, different processes, and that decentralized, diverse nature actually creates incredible resilience, because it means that a threat actor could not impact election infrastructure at scale. And that's why I say election infrastructure is so secure. But Allie, I should make
I'm so sorry to cut you off, Jen, because you're making such fantastic points, and all of it meant to underscore the confidence that we have, thankfully, in our election systems with just over 2 weeks to go. I'm sure that you and I will have many more of these conversations, and I'm thankful that we can. CISA Director Jen Easterly, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
Still to come, new explosions in Beirut captured on our reporter's camera there after a weekend of heavy cross-border fire between Israel and Hezbollah. We're live in Lebanon. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We're following breaking news out of the Middle East right now as Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his way to the region. It's just in the last few minutes, our NBC News team reports they've seen multiple explosions in Beirut. You can see that bright flash of light along the skyline. It follows more strikes yesterday, causing hundreds of civilians in Beirut to flee their homes after the IDF issued an evacuation order ahead of strikes targeting Hezbollah's financial infrastructure. Joining me now is Matt Bradley in Beirut. Matt, what more can you tell us about these latest strikes on Lebanon and its financial system?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, these are ongoing. And in fact, we saw just a couple of moments ago, right behind us, right along the skyline here. This is a Shiite majority area. This is a Hezbollah stronghold. And this is where we've been seeing the Israelis pounding Hezbollah time after time again. Important to note that until recently, this was also very much a residential area. It's now been gutted of people. We understand most of them have been displaced. But the Israelis came out just a couple of hours ago and warned anybody who was still in this area to leave because they were going to be launching a fresh new round of strikes. They said, hitting this time a reserve of cash, actual currency that Hezbollah was holding in an underground bunker. This came a day after the Israelis gave a similar warning to what is essentially a commercial bank, an Islamic bank that provides funding commercially to people on Islamic terms. So in other words, no interest, but that the Israelis said was used as a front by the Iranians in order to basically finance Hezbollah operations. So we are now seeing in an undisputable way, and one that the Israelis are very upfront about, the Israelis turning their guns from the leadership and actual military installations of Hezbollah onto their financing, their finance, instruments, banks, really bank branches, the kind of place where people can go in and apply for loans or settle accounts or open accounts, take cash. And these were places that it wasn't just Hezbollah supporters were using. They were actually, after the financial crisis here 5 years ago, used by all manner of Lebanese people across different sects because of the financial difficulties that so many people had been facing. Now, those places very much in the crosshairs. Ali?
And then, of course, Matt, quickly in the last few seconds we have, Secretary Blinken is on his way to the region, but the U.S. Special Envoy is also in the region holding meetings of his own. What do we know about these conversations?
That's right. And he was actually speaking with Nabih Berri, who's the Speaker of the Parliament here. He was saying that they should not just settle all of the parties involved here in Lebanon and in Israel with just a resolution that resolved the conflict back in 2006, the last time there was a big conflagration between the Israelis and Hezbollah. This time, he says they need to solve this conflict for good. But as you can see with these continuing bombings, there isn't a resolution at hand.
Yeah, certainly not the resolution that we hoped for at this point. Matt Bradley, thank you and stay safe. And we are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. Lucky for you, the news continues with my friend Tom Costello, who's in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.